Welcome back. In today's lecture, we move to the next stage of the prototyping process, creation of low-fidelity interactive prototypes. So a lo-fi prototype is a representation of the design made with lightweight tools and materials that enables early testing of concepts, layout, and user interactions. The purpose of lo-fi prototypes is to give the stakeholders a chance to interactively explore an early stage of the design concept. Lo-fi prototypes thus maximize the number of times that designers are able to revise and refine their design before it is committed to code. So how do we make lo-fi prototypes? The key piece here is that we should be using materials that are quick to use, that are disposable, and that allow creation of the prototypes in a really fast, iterative fashion. There are a number of different kinds of materials and approaches that can be used. The most common ones are to just use basically paper, tape, post-it notes, cardboard, things like that, to create what is normally called a paper prototype, which is basically just a paper representation of the system that the designer is trying to create. The essential pieces of that are sketches. So the sketches and wireframes of the system can then be combined with buttons and tape to allow the prototype to be more interactive, as well as screenshots of already existing applications that can potentially act as a background on which the designer superimposes their own design elements. There are also more high-tech ways to create lo-fi prototypes, including things like PowerPoint, where each slide in the presentation can act as one screen of the application, and the designer uses links between slides to mimic interactive behavior. As well as things like wireframing software, like balsamic mockups that we saw earlier this week, that allow the designers to both create wireframes for each screen of the application, as well as then to mimic the behavior of clicking on buttons and interacting with those wireframes. So how do we prototype? We always start with a set of wireframes for each screen of the task sequences that we want to prototype. And so this is key. So the wireframes that we discussed in the last lecture of this course are the essential building blocks of an interactive prototype. Once those wireframes are done, then the designer needs to create the various additional elements like system responses, pop-up windows, progress bars, and other things that allow the wireframes to transition from one state to the next. And these things should correspond to each action that the user takes in the wireframes. In addition, the designer needs to create dummy content, things like text and images and pop-up keyboards that would result from the user actions, such as filling a password in a password form. So in that case, you might want to have a little piece of paper that just has a bunch of asterisks that you can put onto the field into the paper prototype to mimic what would happen when the user typed the password. Finally, to try to ensure that each user action transitions to a prototype into a state that the prototype can support, you should really think through the full task sequence and then make sure that those task sequences contain all the prototype contains all the elements that task sequence requires. When you do that, you result with a representation of the design that can literally be run. That can be manipulated in a way that transitions the prototype from one state to the other to provide stakeholders with an experience of how the system would behave if it were actually coded up and created to be real. There are several methodological tips that can make this process more effective. One is that really you should be thinking of the paper prototype or other lo-fi interactive prototypes as representing full task sequences. So think about something like doing a search for a product on Amazon. If you're going to prototype that in a lo-fi prototype, you want to be able to ensure that the prototype supports both doing the actual search, so typing in the search terms, the list of results that shows up after the search term is entered, digging into one of those results to see the details about that result, as well as potentially allowing the user to press the purchase button and then go through the checkout process. So this is a full task sequence that involves searching for an object and purchasing it, and the prototype would want to be able to support all of that if you're going to create it. The other thing is that experience is made a lot better in paper prototypes if every state of the prototype is realized so that anything that the user does with the prototype, such as, for example, press a text field, actually results in an action that corresponds to what the real system would do. So in this case, a keyboard might pop up, and you might want to have a little piece of paper with a keyboard pop-up that you put onto the prototype to show that the keyboard would enter when the text field is tapped. What is really nice about paper prototypes is that you can represent transitions in state in very effective ways with very, very simple tools. So for example, if you're trying to show scrolling, you can have a longer piece of paper that you put through a gap or cutout on another piece of paper and then slowly pull it through the cutout to represent how the content would be changing on the screen as the user scrolls. So very simple techniques using folding, using cutouts, using tape allow paper prototypes to represent relatively sophisticated dynamic behavior. Finally, a paper prototype of a complex system is relatively easy to create, and many prototypes can be done in a matter of just a couple of hours, up to 4 or 5 hours at most. This allows designers to prototype full systems as soon as they understand what the basic functionality needs to be and to try to start getting feedback on those systems. Todd Hausman, who is a designer at Google, said once that the fidelity of your prototype should match the fidelity of your thinking. So don't be afraid to share your prototypes early and often. And I really like this statement because it really indicates that the value of lo-fi prototypes. Because the fact that they look rough, the fact that they're just sketched out on paper and use post-it notes and tape to represent behavior, frees the users to give you valuable and honest feedback about the design concepts without getting wrapped up in small design details. So this allows lo-fi prototypes to answer a number of important questions. First, it allows prototypes to answer the question whether the user even understands what the system is about, right? Do they understand what they should do when they're presented with the system? Are they fully able to execute the tasks that the prototype is supposed to support? Insofar as the prototype contains full sequences, the user should be able to figure out how to get through that sequence on their own without being held by the designer. Does the way that the design handles those tasks that it's supposed to support make sense, right? Are there actually better ways to do this and the user can give you feedback on another way the same task can be accomplished? Are the users getting confused and stuck? This is one of the first things that paper prototypes and other low-fidelity prototypes reveal, is that sometimes the navigation is just broken. People forget to include, for example, the home button, so it's impossible for a user to get back to the main menu or the main screen of the application. Are the navigational elements adequate, right? Are you able to actually transition from one state to another with information that is presented on the screen? All of these issues can be addressed with prototypes that are designed in just a couple of hours. So just to summarize, and this is a really nice statement from Bill Morgridge, lo-fi prototypes are not precious. They can be created quickly, they can be discarded just as quickly, and therefore they invite honest critique and allow the designer to get feedback early and to get feedback often. To summarize then, lo-fi prototypes are cheap, disposable ways to interactively test early design ideas. Users are able to interact with a fully functional system and provide feedback both on the design concepts and lower-level design features such as layout and navigation. Low fidelity focuses users on the design concepts without necessarily getting them wrapped up in thinking about visual design such as colors and fonts that they typically gravitate to when they're working with a higher fidelity prototype. And finally, just the quickness of creating prototypes and the ability for designers to make new prototypes easily really encourage repeated prototyping so that the designers can assess their ideas multiple times before they commit them to a higher fidelity form. This makes vetting of early design concepts much more powerful and enable designers to be relatively certain that ideas they end up with are effective and have strong user acceptance before they spend the time to produce high fidelity mockups. Thank you for watching and see you next time.